And welcome. My name's Melanie and I'm the Programs Coordinator at Hornsby Library. Our event tonight is in collaboration with Stanton and Lane Cove Libraries, and I'd like to welcome you all. I acknowledge that wherever we are in Australia, we stand on the traditional lands of the Aboriginal peoples. I recognise the traditional custodians of these lands and the continuing connection to land, culture, community and story, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Here at Hornsby, we're on the lands of the Darug and Gurungai peoples, and I invite you to recognise the custodians of the country you are on. Heather Morris is an internationally best-selling author whose first two books, The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Cilka's Journey, have sold more than 6 million copies worldwide. Heather's ability to listen patiently and without judgment led to her writing The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which told Lally and Geeta's story, and her time with Lally led her to Cilka. And then the process of writing these books has led her to even more opportunities where she's been entrusted with other people's stories that she plans to share with us in the future. In her new book, Stories of Hope, Heather tells us how she developed the skills to be an active listener and what she's learned from this. She gives us many practical tips on how to use those skills to make deeper connections with the people around us. Now, we're going to have questions throughout the talk, so if you've got anything that you'd like to ask Heather, please type it in the question and A box on the bottom of your screen. Heather, welcome back to Hornsby Library. It is so wonderful to see you.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. And I just wish I could be there in person, but I'll settle for this if I have to. But always a pleasure to be chatting to the people up in Hornsby and around. Yeah, thank you. And please, if you do have questions, fire them through, because I'd much rather they came through while I was talking. And that way you get to ask your question without me inadvertently answering it and you going, oh, damn, I wanted to ask her that. So come on, keep them coming.
Thank you, Heather. Heather, I was going through and rereading the introduction to your book this morning, and you described the tentative hope that most of us greeted the new year of 2020 with, and I mean that it already feels like a million years ago. It was, of course, tempered by our concerns about the bushfires that we're all experiencing then, but little did we know what was to come this year. You touch on how difficult this pandemic experience has been for so many people. Why do you think it's important to acknowledge that?
It's really crazy, Melanie. I wrote this book last year. I finished writing it earlier this year before the pandemic even hit. So that little introduction in the front is something that we frantically put in because I needed to acknowledge that this has been a crap year for us here in Australia. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic. And given that this book is being written for a global audience, just not Australia, I needed to acknowledge how it started back in January with horrendous bushfires. And then we went into floods. And then before we knew it, we had the 1 in 100 year pandemic. And when you're writing a book about hope, it just occurred to me that I needed to make a statement above and beyond what the book already had laid out. And in there, I think, and I touched on a couple of other matters like Black Lives Matter. I mean, the kind of movement that drew us all to. And of course, climate change. These are things that they're impacting us right now, even in a pandemic. And I wanted to just say, look for some hope, even in these darkest of times, because golly gosh, that's what Lally and Geeta and Cilka and all those other amazing people that have come into my life, that's what got them through. They were lucky, but they had hope.
Heather, one of the quotes that you refer to often that Lala used to say was, all you have to do is get up in the morning. And I found that in a funny, really quite a comforting thing to think about. At the moment, we're all just doing our best. What do you think he would have made of all this?
He'd be really cranky. Absolutely. If somebody said to him, and this isn't, sorry, Lally, you cannot go down to your local cafe, he would want to know why not. And even when explained to him, he would probably struggle to accept it. And being told, well, you can go and get a takeaway, maybe, that wouldn't go down well with him. He had lived under these terrible regimes, not only the Holocaust, but also back in Slovakia after he got out, or got away. And for him, any kind of restriction on him, he would not have handled it well, as would be my take on how Lally would be right now. Sorry, mate. It's calling it how I see it.
Heather, you are quite literally one of the hardest working authors that I've ever met. You travel like no one else I've ever seen. You're constantly going all around the world to share Lele's stories and your work in general. And it seems to me that you never take a break or rest. How's it been for you being forced to stay at home for all this time?
Hate it on so many levels. And but mostly because I do enjoy traveling. But what I enjoy about traveling is meeting people and being able to have them come up and talk to me afterwards and just have those, few minutes with all these different people from incredible walks of life. There is nothing more rewarding than connecting with other humans and the odd dog. But look, I love it. I don't know if everybody does. I know many people and even other authors I've met who are saying, I just can't do that. It just is too intimidating for them to put themselves out there. Maybe because I'm older, I'm putting myself out there, folks. And, you can come and bring me brickbats or bouquets. I don't mind. I'm happy to meet you and I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. And I've had some pretty amazing conversations with some pretty amazing people.
Oh, good on you. It's something that I really admire about you. Heather, this new book, of course, is your first work of non-fiction. Your other books have been fiction, although they're based on real stories that have been shared with you. Can you tell me a little bit about what brought you to the place where you wanted to write this book?
A very persistent publisher, shall we say. How this book came about is really quite lovely in some ways. I was researching Cilka's story and I was going in and out of Slovakia to speak to the friends and neighbours who had known her for decades. And the last trip I made there, I went via London and my publisher, Margaret, fellow Kiwi, she came with me. And so we went to Koshita and my friends in Luddy's hometown of Krompaki, it's about an hour out of Koshita, they'd arranged for me to meet these people who were once again giving me information about Cilka. And these people, their ages ranged from say 50 to well into their 90s, and they had known her for decades. And sitting around with two translators and about 10 or so of these neighbors squashed into a tiny little lounge room in an apartment next door to where Cilka in fact had lived, right next door. And I was just listening to these people and they're all talking 10 to the dozen. They're all wanting to share their story with me. The two translators are firing off, trying to tell me what they're saying. And my publisher, Margaret, was sitting there just observing. And every now and then she'd ask a question and she said, they didn't even look at her. Same thing as I did with Lele. I didn't take notes. I didn't record. I just engaged, even though I couldn't understand them and they couldn't understand me. It didn't seem to matter. So later on that night, I'll be brief, I went back to the hotel room, we had dinner, had a couple of glasses of wine, and then went, oh, look, there's a bar here in this hotel, and it was sort of downstairs in a dungeon area. Let's go and sit down there and just have another drink. And Margaret made the comment, she sort of said, just watching how people just seem to engage with you and you weren't even trying. She said, how could you do that? And what makes you able to listen and have people want to tell you two different things? And where did you learn it? And I immediately just said, oh, my great-grandfather. He was this man in my life who, as a child, the only adult I considered either spoke to me or listened to me. And in that dungeon bar in the city of Košice in Slovakia, she said to me, there's your next book. You write a book about listening, starting with Gramps, your great-grandfather. That's how it came about, and it kind of went from there.
Well, we're lucky that you did. I actually wanted to ask you about your Gramps. So early in the book, you talk about the fact that options were limited for women in the small rural area of New Zealand where you grew up. You learned from your mother that a girl was doomed to a life of hard work and limited freedom, which was not what you were going to stand for. And it seemed to me that something that gave you respite from that, that let you not accept that was the only option for you, was the relationship that you had with your Gramps and the stories he shared with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, look, he was this amazing old man and great-grandfather, folks, not grandfather, great-grandfather.
Oh, beg your pardon.
And no, that's fine. But he lived 2 paddocks away from me And so I used to walk through the paddocks and past his home where he and my great-grandmother lived, every day going to and from school. I had 4 brothers, and I think initially he just sort of felt sorry for me living in a household with 4 boys. There just seemed to be nothing but noise, and generally them making a noise and my mother yelling at them. And he started having me stop after school and sit with him. And then we set up that we just started through no reason particular. He started telling me about his life as a young boy, as a teenager. And I share some of those in the book, and his time being finding himself in South Africa, the Boer War. So that kind of dates him, folks. He shouldn't have been there. But hearing him tell these stories, and he'd go and get an object. Sometimes he'd be waiting for me, and he'd have something in his hand, and it was something he'd brought back from South Africa. Or it was something connected to the local Maori people that he'd had for many, many decades, and would just tell me about it and where he got it and what it meant. And I was spellbound by him. He took the time to talk to me, but every now and then he'd say, "We're just listening today, girlie." And that meant we just had to sit quietly and listen to whatever sound was around. And when you do that, that's when you start focusing in on the white noise, I think it is, that you just ignore 9 times out of 10. Literally the sounds of the birds, the sounds of the cows being brought up to be milked, the dogs barking, the mother yelling at the brothers. When you just sit quietly and listen to them, they tell a story. And that's what I loved most about my time with him, how he taught me there was nothing wrong with sitting in silence. You don't have to fill the gaps. And that's what I do when I'm talking to people like Lally and the people who knew Cilka, that if there's a pause in the conversation, you don't feel the need to fill it. Just sit in it for a little bit and see where it takes you. So yeah, that was Gramps, this amazing man.
Well, I think you were so lucky to have him in your life. And as you say, it was really the perfect training, not that you knew it, for what was to come for you in the future. Something that struck me is that throughout the book, you talk a lot about the importance of not having judgment, to try to be free of that. And, again, as you say in the book, there's been readers who sometimes have been critical of some of the choices that Lale made in his life. And, there are at times people who, there are people who will criticise anything. There are people who sometimes, criticise who has the right to tell a particular story or anything like that. But you say you do not get to judge. You cannot tell me the choices you would have made in these same circumstances. Can you talk to us about how important it was for you to be able to listen without judgment so people felt they could tell you their full stories?
Oh, profoundly important. And, you just think about right now, living where we are, and somebody says, well, look, I spent the whole time during lockdown eating chocolate and watching Netflix, like we talked about earlier. And somebody could say, well, I don't think that was a very good way to spend your time. Well, no, you do not get to judge even something as simple as that. So if I'm not going to allow you to judge that. I'm sure as hell not going to accept anyone judging somebody surviving the Holocaust. Just not going to happen. And I can get a little bit sort of caught up in this, and I'll settle down, don't worry. But it's quite true. And, and here's another example. There's the next story that I'm writing. I was in Israel in January with 2 of the three sisters, 2 of them are still alive, whose story I'm writing. And the one who has died, who I never got to meet, somebody was reading to me her testimony that she had written, just sort of self-published testimony. And it was all written in Hebrew, so I couldn't read it. And it was the niece of this woman was reading it to me. And I was recording it just to hear this woman's words. And what her last words in this woman, whose survival and whose story you will read about in 12 months' time, the last words that she has written in this testimony is, "Do not judge us." And I went, yeah, Sibby, you nailed it, love, because we should give thanks that there is probably no way in hell that we will ever have to walk a mile in the shoes of those people. So yeah, as I said, I can get a little bit carried away when people start judging, but I'll calm down and say, just think about it before you open your mouth. That's what it's all about. Think about it.
Heather, I think that it's a really wonderful thing for us all to think about more closely, to have some more empathy, and as you say, to walk in other people's shoes before we're too quick to jump to those conclusions. Oh, we've got a question from Amy. Amy, thank you for asking a question. Heather, Amy's asking, how or where do you draw the line between fact and fiction, and how do you decide what to fictionalise?
Facts can be found in documents. They cannot necessarily be found in individual testimonies. And when I was doing Lully's story in particular, I had this man's memory, and it came down to history as recorded by academics and historians, which tends to be the big picture of what happens in the world. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how we record COVID-19 in Australia and Melbourne in particular. But the set of facts are not necessarily always going to be correct either. Now, I was told that in Hebrew, there is no word for history, no word. A rabbi in Sydney introducing me said, all our stories must come from memory. Now, here's a fact, Amy. When I was writing Cilka's story, and we were getting all the research that we could, every database that we went to related to the Holocaust, and I'm talking about Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust database, the Auschwitz Museum's database. These are the preeminent databases that have the constructs of everybody who supposedly was in the Holocaust, whether they survived or not. Now, in every one of those databases, we found Cilka's name. So Cecilia Cilka Klein, exact same date of birth, town she was born in. Every single one of them had after that the 3 words, murdered in Auschwitz. Now that is a factual documents from database. And we know that she wasn't. And so even facts when recorded can be incorrect. Now we were lucky that when we were researching Cilka back in Slovakia, and the Slovakian authorities were wonderful. They let me see so many of her family documents that I really had no right to. I'm talking about birth, deaths, and marriage certificates for her and her family. And when we were finally shown Cilka's birth registration, it's in this massive big journal, it's handwritten. Nothing is in computers there yet, or not historically anyway. And we saw this beautiful handwriting in this journal, massive book that had over 200 years worth of births written in it. And at the end, tacked on to Cilka's, with a different handwriting and clearly a different pen and time, something was written. And when I asked my translators, what does that say? And they looked and went, oh my goodness. And the words written into that journal that was hundreds of years old alongside Cilka's name were that on this day in 1958, Cecilia Klein came to this office, bringing with her the document from the government of Slovakia, declaring her to be a citizen of Czechoslovakia and declaring her to still be alive. So Cilka had gone back to this town where she was born. She didn't actually live there as a child. She moved when she was very young. So there's the fact, Amy. The fact is that the databases say she was murdered in Auschwitz. Cilka herself says, no, I wasn't. And I went back in 1958 when I was released from Siberia, and I made sure that that was documented. So yeah, I know it's a touchy one. I'm prepared to go always with the memory of the person who's telling me their story. If I can confirm it and back it up with facts, well and good. If I can't always, then I'll take that calculated risk and decide what to write.
That's a wonderful story, Heather. But again, that comes back to why you wrote it as a work of fiction, though, rather than as non-fiction, because it's people's personal memories and so on. That's right, isn't it?
Well, there's that about it. And also to write it as a memoir was very restrictive. I could not have put in what was going on with Gita in the women's camp, because a memoir has got to be only what Lully had seen and
Yes.
experienced. So she'd be out. But I had met these wonderful people who knew Gita and knew people that were in there with her, and they could tell me what it was like. So I wanted to tell you. I wanted to be able to tell you what was going on around them. And memoir was just too restrictive, and I couldn't have dialogue. I wrote this as a screenplay. I'm all about the conversation. I'm all about the words and the talking. So that's why it was written, not because I was trying to dodge any facts or create anything that did not exist. In fact, I left out some really incredibly important aspects of Lali's life, not in the book, because I did actually say, oh, I think I cannot confirm this historically. And I think what you've told me and your role in it, that I could get in the poo for if I went ahead with it. And the bugger of it is that since the book came out, people in other countries have contacted me and confirmed storylines not in the book because I did hesitate and decide not to put them in. And Lally, who read the screenplay that I wrote about it, he was damn cranky about that. I want you to put that in, and I had to fight him on it. So
how frustrating for you, Heather.
I know, maybe I should write it again.
Can you imagine? Heather, we've got a question from Mozzie in the audience who acknowledges that there's been some criticism about the first two books. Do you feel like there's anything you need to respond to about that?
I accept that everybody's entitled to their own opinion on how I've chosen to tell these stories. And when that criticism comes from a significant body, and the criticism you're probably referring to is from the Auschwitz Museum. You know, there is this museum, by the way, I've been to Auschwitz several times, and it's kind of weird because they kind of welcome me when I go there, and not so much when they want to get in touch with a journalist and write something about me. And so they are not happy with the way I have told the story, because I've not written about the Holocaust. I've just written a Holocaust story.
Yes.
But then I go to Yad Vashem, which is the biggest Holocaust memorial in the world, in Jerusalem. And I meet people there who are selling my books, both in English and in Hebrew. And I meet the people that are significant people at Yad Vashem, and they say, this is a brilliant telling of one man's experience. So it comes down to, not being able to please all of the people all of the time. Where it comes to Cilka, and this is once again where I kind of get on a little bit of a high horse, to be criticized because I dared to mention and talk about and not shy away from the sexual abuse of her, and by default, so many other girls and women during times of conflict. I just won't accept that anymore, that we have to shut up about that. And all the research we did about why it has not been part of the story of the Holocaust, we were told and discovered that we don't want to shame these women, so we're not going to talk about it. Well, I'm sorry, it's our shame that we allowed these women to live with decades and decades, not acknowledging the sexual abuse that they were confronted with. And so that one, I'm sorry, I do have my high horse on that one, and I'm championing, like all those other educated women only a few years ago who stood up and finally found the courage to say me too. Now, if they were educated celebrity women and they felt shamed into silence, what chance do people like Cilka and other young girls and women? They don't have any, and I will not accept them being referred to as a spoil of war or comfort woman. That is the biggest insult that you can ever give to these women. And they don't need to be ashamed. We should be ashamed. And I'll settle down now, okay?
Heather, I think if there's going to be a topic to be on your high horse about, I think that's a great one. As a reader, I found, when Cilka was described as being a bad girl, such a hard thing to read, this poor brave woman who did so many wonderful things, and, through circumstances that were not her choice, things happened that she would never have wanted to happen. And, it's important for us to talk about these things. She wasn't a bad girl. She was a girl who bad things happened to.
And she was just a girl, 16 years of age.
Yes.
And here's the other interesting thing, that while there is criticism, of course, about my talking about sexual abuse of the girls during the Holocaust, the Russians, who not only have bought both those books, they've bought already Stories of Hope, and they've already bought the book I'm still writing. They don't have any problem whatsoever with me identifying them as being these really bad dudes who ran those gulags, and they're not shying away from it. Yeah, it happened.
Heather, we've got another question here. They're saying that hope is a great title for the current times because we live in a very abundant time and COVID's made us stop and reflect a little. You touched on that in the introduction.
Yeah.
How do you see hope given the impacts of technology and social media influencing our collective futures?
Look, I'm not a fan of too much social media, other of course than zooming in with you. This is brilliant. Love this. I think that it can take up so much time. And I see that, and even a couple of young members of my own family who are taking too much from what they're reading through different social media platforms. And that's where they're getting their information from. And it's kind of sad because you can take it or reject whatever you hear on the news. And look, even news and reading newspapers these days is not the same as it used to be. But all to me, it's just a matter of, for most of us, we have a moral compass about what's acceptable and what's acceptable to us. And when you read anything on social media or any other media, hear about it, that it doesn't quite gel with your own moral compass, then take it with a grain of salt, because we're just being hammered by it. And I am a little bit, but thankfully I have other people in my life who do my Instagram for me and my Facebook for me, and that's naughty, and I'm probably not meant to admit. I read them all, okay? Anyone out there who's ever posted something on my Instagram, I do read everything there and on Facebook. And I've even taken to responding a few times too, but it can be just so time consuming, but it is a great way to connect. I accept that. I do accept that.
But you're right, but it has its good and its bad points. Now, Heather, for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, and of course many people won't because it's so new, you do talk a lot about your stories about Lele and so on, but actually you talk a lot more other different people that you've met. And one of the stories that I was really interested by was your story of meeting Eddie in Timor-Leste. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Oh my goodness. Wow. If anybody needs to be put on a pedestal, it's this man. And you're quite right. I'm just so lucky to have met all these amazing people. And that's what the Stories of Hope is just trying to also give you all these little bits about Lale that I talk about that people don't know about my relationship with him. It seems that's what people are more interested in. I've read your book. I don't need you to talk about that. But yes, when I went to Timor-Leste about 4 years ago, and I was there with a cardiologist and his wife and a medical team. I worked in a hospital environment, and I met this man. He was the translator and he was the guide and the person there to look after me and the team that were there from this medical team. But I spent quite a bit of time with this man, and I'd been told in advance how amazing he was. But to see for myself, when he was a boy, when Timor-Leste was invaded, and he and his parents and another sibling managed to get out on this boat as the Indonesians invaded, and they killed nearly a quarter of that population of that island. He lost a brother there. His oldest brother didn't get out. Now, Eddie came and got educated in Australia. And as soon as independence was declared back in Timor-Leste, even before it would settle down and it was still pretty hostile, he packed up and went back. To him, he had to do everything he could to help this country, this fledgling country. I think it's about the third poorest in the world. I've met many, many people here in Australia too, mostly patients, by the way, from Timor-Leste. But I spent time with this man. I saw how when I was with him driving through these not even villages, we went up to a mountain and spent 2 days up in the hills with him. People were coming out in the street as they heard that he was driving through. They knew his car, and people were literally going, Eddie, Eddie. He is so revered. what he does in terms of wanting his population educated, their health taken care of, water, something as simple as getting water from the top of the mountain all the way down the hills past all these villages. And he's been instrumental in helping them create. And the water, by the way, is coming down bamboo, being just stuck on a pipe, and then the bamboo tied to it with flax, and the water comes down. Every politician in that country, for ever since its independence, has tried to get Eddie to be part of the government and be part of them. And he won't have a bar of it, because he can achieve so much more, and does achieve so much, by being this independent person who just wants the best for his fellow countrymen. I've never met a man that it was so incredibly humble and giving. He said to his wife, he told me when he proposed to her, that he couldn't buy her a ring as a sign of an engagement, and he hoped that she would be okay not even having a wedding ring or a wedding, because every cent that he gets his hands on goes back into health or education for others. And I did get to meet his beautiful wife too, and to her, yeah, no, that's fine. That's who he is. I hope to be able to tell his story. He's given me permission to tell his story. I've just got to find time to get myself back to Dili.
Heather, I don't know how you're going to find the time to tell all the stories that you have to tell, but as I say, you certainly are a hardworking writer. I don't doubt that you will get to them all. I've got another question that's come through, and this one is from Amanda. She's asked, which part in any of the stories that you've worked on have been the hardest for you to write or invoked the most emotion for you personally?
Oh, look, thank you, Amanda. Look, I'd have to say Cilka's story, because when I was reading through the information that I had a professional researcher in Moscow find me all the information about Vorkuta, the gulag that she was in. And when I was getting that, and it was testimonies, it was documents, it was photos and reports, the Russians weren't quite as good as the Nazis at keeping documents, but there was certainly plenty of them to be sent my way. And when I was writing Lily's story, and it would get just so cumbersome and so distressing for me, well, I would just go around to Lily, and he would comfort me, and he'd give me a hug and tell me, it's okay. Look, I'm here, I'm fine. And he gave me that comfort to be able to continue to tell his story, even though I was weighed down with it. And I never had him or anybody around when I was writing Cilka's, and it wasn't the writing so much. Well, it kind of was, but it was that reading of what happened to her, and hearing it, and then having to write those words. All I could do was yell at the husband and the dog and the cat. They copped a lot, because that was really tough. That was tough. And I'm so delighted that my next story, 2 of the 3 sisters are still alive, even though they are in Tel Aviv and I can't get back to them. But and I do phone video chats with this 94-year-old lady in Tel Aviv, and it's just wonderful, because once again, she's there to say, no, that's fine, you're doing right, and that's the way it is. I'm here, and remind me, look at me, I'm now 94 years of age, and I've lived a fantastic life, no matter what got thrown at me.
So Heather, we've touched on this a few times tonight, and it comes up throughout the book. So you talk about the stories of these 3 sisters from Slovakia, and this is, I suspect, the next book that you've got coming out. Is there anything at all that you can tell us about that?
There's a little bit of it in the back of the book, so you can read a little tiny essay that I wrote about it. But here's the magnificence of how my life has changed in the last 2.5, 3 years. I think it was about June last year, and I was in South Africa, and I was at a book festival there in a little place called Franschhoek, just out of Cape Town. And by the way, Franschhoek is the wine region of South Africa, and it's pretty nice. In fact, it's very nice. And I got back to my hotel room at about 2 o'clock one morning, and I wasn't tired. And I opened an email. And it was an email from a man telling me that he lived in Toronto in Canada, and he had flown to visit his mother, who lived in Tel Aviv. 2 days earlier, picked up my book, and Canada has the same cover as we do. He picked up the book at the Toronto airport, got on the plane, flew to Tel Aviv. The next day he came out and he was going to read it, and he left it on his mother's coffee table. And his mother, he wrote and told me in this email, she walked past, looked down at the cover, and she just simply said, well, that must be about Lali and Gita. Now, here was this woman in Tel Aviv. Her son lives in Toronto. I'm an Aussie living in Melbourne, but I'm currently sitting in a hotel room in Franschhoek, South Africa, and I'm reading these words. And he told me that his mother, of course, she recognized that. She saw the numbers on the arm. Her number is 3 away from Gita's. Her sister's is 2 away. They went to school with Gita. They were on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. In fact, Gita had even visited them in Israel back in the 80s and 90s. And she remembered Lali tattooing them. Now, she was one of 3 sisters. She was only 15, this one. She was 15 and Magda was 17, Sibi 19. Now, for 3 sisters to survive, not just the Holocaust, but to survive Auschwitz is a pretty rare thing. Now, I know you're saying, oh, not another Holocaust story. Come on, get out of it. But this is the wonder of that period of history. Everyone's story is different. And that comes back to what we were saying right at the very beginning. You cannot say what happened to Lali is inaccurate and factually incorrect because it didn't happen to somebody else that was there, because they are all different. And the only people who say that, by the way, and everyone says, are survivors. They say it. And so for these 3 girls, you're just not going to hear about their time during the Holocaust and being taken. That's only about a third of the book. They had an escape from the death march, which you read a little bit about, which could be a book in itself. These young girls in January, Poland, winter, running from the Nazis, and their escape and what happened to them during that time. But then there's more. They get back to Slovakia, they get home and they're not welcomed. There's no family there, they've all gone. And after spending a couple of years trying to make a life back in their home country, it's just not happening. So what do these young girls do? Well, along with a few other young Holocaust survivors, Jewish boys and girls, they went into the forests of Czechoslovakia, and there they trained to become freedom fighters. They were those first people who made their way after having been smuggled all the way through Czechoslovakia, through Romania, all through communist-run countries to get to the Black Sea, to get on board a ship and find themselves stepping off in Haifa in Palestine/Israel. And so they are the founding freedom fighters of the state of Israel. And we're looking and researching all the books. There's many, many books, once again, written about that. But again, big picture. It's what the politicians and the bureaucrats and the military, how they saw the formation of Israel. Good or bad. I don't judge the fact that they came there to take over a land which at that point in time, the Palestinians were the custodians of. I'm not going to get into the politics of it. These were 3 young girls who had everything taken away from them, and they were no longer safe in the country where they came from. And to me, they had every right to try and find a safe place to live. And so their story is, they go from these young girls in Slovakia through the Holocaust to reject and training to be freedom fighters. And I'm giving away the opening. I open with Livia. Livia was the youngest. She's the one I talked to. She's got the best English out of her and Magda. And she got to meet the first president of Israel and work for him. And so she goes from these humble beginnings to being in the house of the first president of Israel.
Well, that's an amazing story. And I feel that I can say with confidence people are not sick of hearing that you're going to write another Holocaust story, but in fact will be very excited and looking forward to reading this one. And I mean, as you say, these are all vastly different stories. story
Ah.
that you're sharing. Yes.
And I'll write things that Livia in particular saw in Birkenau that is documented historically because it relates to another prisoner there, an escaped prisoner. But she had a pivotal role in what happened to this young girl. And none of that's been written up about because she's not spoken before. But this story of this other person is well and truly documented. In fact, songs have been written about her. I think a whole bloody opera has been written about her because she's significant in the story of the Holocaust. But Livia has got the ending because she was there. She knows the ending to the story. So.
Now, I just want to say to everybody who's watching from home, if you do have any questions, don't be shy about popping them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We've got about 15 minutes left. So what always happens is everybody leaves their questions until right at the last minute, but we do need to finish promptly on time tonight because Heather, who, as I say, is a very hardworking author, has got another commitment. So if you want to ask anything, please don't be shy. And in fact, if you don't have a question, but you would just like to write a message to Heather, you can put that in the Q&A box and we won't read it out live, but I'll share all the questions and comments with you afterwards. So if you'd like to do that, please do feel free to do that. Now, Heather, as we say, this wonderful book, Stories of Hope, of course, you do talk about Lele in it, but there's so many other things that are in here. And at its heart, it is a story about the value of listening and what that means to us. Now, you talk about the value of listening to our elders, but you also talk about how rewarding you find it to make these connections with young people. And as some people might know, a young adult edition of The Tattooist of Auschwitz has been published, and this has given you the opportunity to meet and talk with many young people. Can you talk to us about that? Because I know you particularly enjoy that.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so proud and delighted to talk into the schools, and I do that. I do, well, Zoom now, but when I can, I go in person. But sometimes I'm Zooming into a school and there'll be about 4 classrooms, and there'll be anywhere up to 150, 200 students all sitting, and I'll see the 4 different monitors in their different classrooms. And just like you and I are talking, Melanie, I say straight up the bat, find the first brave child or student who's going to come up and ask a question. And it'll be, the entire hour will be taken up with just these kids coming up and poking in front of the camera and asking a question, because they've already read the book and I'd rather answer their questions and then fly off and tell them what I think they want to know. Now, just yesterday, I did one of these talks into a school here in Melbourne. Now, there are some of the kids were back in classes, the first year 7s, so the 14-year-olds, but the other year 8s and 9s, because they're still not back at school yet, because we're still locked down. But they connected through Zoom. And it was a wonderful chat. And at the end, the teachers asked me, look, could we just wrap up, 5 or 6 minutes before normally? Because 2 of the girls wanted to give back something to me. Now, this is the first. The first one read a short story that she had written, taking inspiration from the Tattooist of Auschwitz. It wasn't about the Holocaust. It was about her and her finding hope through the message of the Holocaust survivors. This was a non-Jewish school too, by the way. And she read this beautiful short story that she had written. And then the next one, she sang and played the piano, a song she had written. Just for me, I was the first person to hear this song, this young girl. So yeah, it's pretty amazing that students connect so well. And I love talking into the schools. I do a lot into the UK as well. Once again, sometimes 2 or 3 schools in a small area will bring their students into their classrooms, and I'll talk into several schools at once. And here's something, and we were talking about Cilka and what happened to her. It's only about 2 weeks ago. We got an email from a teacher in a small place in upstate New York. And she told me she was the teacher in this school, and all her students, they ranged from 14 to 18. And they had been taken out of their ordinary classrooms and they were being specially educated, not because there was anything wrong with them in terms of not being able to cope with education, but their backgrounds and their home life Well, dysfunctional doesn't even begin to describe it. Let's just put it that way. And so that she said to me, look, there's only about 10 of them that want to engage with you. And is that too small a number for you to talk to? And for me, there is no such thing as a small number. Now, yes, it meant getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I'm doing a lot of that anyway. And you know what? I chatted to these 10 girls and 2 teachers for nearly 2 hours. And 4 of those 10 students, young girls, came on, and they didn't know about Cilka, by the way. They hadn't read Cilka. They were just finding some hope through Lully's story. 4 of them identified as having been sexually abused since they were tiny children, babies, toddlers. And of their circumstances, none of them were living with a family member. They were all in some kind of care. And have them suddenly, they all knew it about each other, but they started sharing it online and sharing it with me. And that whole notion of how they had been ashamed of ever speaking up. And look, the letters I got from their teachers afterwards confirming the level of abuse these girls had suffered was horrified me. But it was just so beautiful to have them just talking and giving them that out, to be able to talk and connect through me. And even their teachers, who were more than teachers to them. They were more than teachers. They were more than mentors. They were part of their lives. They said, look, they said things that day that they hadn't even said to them before. So it's pretty special to be able to be that conduit for people to open up. And I listened, and they talked and they shared, and they were cuddling dolls. And these are 15, 16-year-old girls finding comfort in a doll. One of them had a dog there and he kept barking, but I said, it doesn't matter. She needed that dog with her. It's pretty special to be able to do that.
Oh, Heather, wow, that's amazing. That's an amazing thing. I guess it leads a little bit into my next question, because, you know, you deal with a lot of stories of trauma, but, you know, before you became a writer, you, of course, had a whole other life, and you social work department of a large hospital for many years, and part of that work was attending many funerals for people who'd lost their little babies.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about what that experience taught you about the art of listening, and also of working through other people's pain so that you can be of use to them?
Well, absolutely. And that's the lesson that you learn when you're dealing with people who are going through something tragic or traumatic, that you have no right to even think you can own any of their pain or any of their trauma. When you're listening to somebody, it's not yours. Now, I got caught up with Lally because I spent so much time with him, and there was a period when he did transfer some of that pain and trauma. It left him, and that's fine, that's great. And I wrongly let it land on my shoulders and took it on board until I got smacked around by a colleague. And, yeah, don't do that. But that's the reality, that you cannot help someone. And I wasn't trying to help him other than write his story and listen to him. But if you take on board what someone is telling you, if it is, as I say, really, really tragic, you in fact can't help them. Even if they don't want your help, you can't help yourself either. You've got to be able to listen to what's being said, acknowledge the bravery of that person saying what they are to you. And that comes from just not your elders, but children. And by the way, I learned, and it's in the book too, it's not quite a memoir, folks. You're not going to hit everything there is to know about me, but there's a little bit about me, because I figured if all these people can be brave enough to tell me stories of themselves, then now I had to put a little bit of myself out there. And yes, you hear about my relationship, particularly with my mother, which could have been better. But I tell you about myself as a mother too. And when it comes to listening to your children, I'm not only talking about listening to the 4, the 5, the 10-year-old. And don't worry about teenagers. They're never going to tell you anything worth listening to anyway, because that's who teenagers are. But our children never stop being our children. And as you know, I write about something that my daughter and son-in-law gave me permission to tell, something that happened to them. with connection to the birth of their third baby, and the horror of postnatal depression, and how I missed it as the mother. I missed it in my own daughter. It was there. Not in so many words, she didn't say the words, but everything about her behaviour was screaming at me, there's a problem here, and I didn't see it. So, yeah, we can miss it, but through hopefully reading about, looking for those cues, the non-verbal ones, they're the ones that you've got to watch out for, because they'll bite you on the bum if you don't.
That's so right, Heather. Heather, we've got 2 more audience questions, and that's probably going to take up our time because we've only got about 10 minutes left. Our first question is, adversity, abuse and chaos can crush some people, but others turn it into an advantage and, you know, it makes diamonds out of them. How does life crush some people? Sorry, I'm just rephrasing the question a little bit, but why do you think it is that life crushes some people and other people come out of it stronger? The person saying that mental health is a growing issue in society today. What do you think that we can do differently to support people through the I guess, the pain and adversity that they're dealing with?
Yeah, well, here's the thing, and I say it right up in the front of the book, by the way. I am not qualified to tell you how to look after yourself, how to seek help, how to help somebody else. I don't have any qualification. I'm not a counsellor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. I'm just somebody who's lived for quite a few decades and been part of other people's times of being really, really beaten down. And you touched on it for 20 years when I was working in the hospital. One of the areas I worked primarily in was helping families who lost a baby. Now, it can be anything worse than losing a newborn baby or having a stillborn baby. To me, no, there cannot be. And I've been touched with it. My daughter also was touched by it. But in terms of being able to, it's called listening. And I come back to that really word. And at the very beginning, you called it the art of listening. Isn't it crazy to think of it as being labelled as an art, that it's something we've forgotten how to do? We haven't forgotten, we just don't do it enough. We don't practice it. But in terms of helping somebody, and why are some people crushed over something and others? Who knows? It could be anything that has happened in their lives prior to you knowing them. You've got a friend and something is happening and they cannot come out of a depression or any kind of anxiety or panic attacks. You actually don't know all their life. You don't know what happened to them as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, and you can't know. And all you can do is, when you're worried about somebody, is just gently get them to try and talk to you and see if they can talk to somebody else who can help them. I'm not the person that can help anyone needing any professional help. All I can do again is listen, and I do that. But because we don't know everybody's background and we don't know what makes people tick, I don't have an answer for why some people manage and some don't. In terms of the Holocaust, every survivor said to me in the first instance, it was because they were lucky. So there was the kickstarter. They were lucky on that moment that they walked in front of that person who flicked their wrists to the left or the right, and in that fraction of a second that it took, determined whether they lived or died. And so that was the luck that then set them on the path of maybe surviving. And then it just took whatever inner strength and whatever they had to go that extra step and get through. But once again, luck had to play a part in it. Luck plays a part in where we live in Australia right now. All you lucky buggers up in New South Wales and other places who get to go out and have a coffee, and I don't. So once again, luck. Never ever look, this is something I used to say to my kids growing up. They knew where I worked, of course. They knew what I did. And when we'd be sitting around the table having dinner each night, and one of them had had a bad day, something had happened, they'd broken up with a boyfriend, a girlfriend, and often they would just say, yeah, but they'd pull back. They'd start saying something and they'd pull back. But yeah, Mum, I know, yeah, there are people way worse off than I am and with worse problems than I have. And I'm sitting here having a meal with my family. And every single time I would remind them, what's happening to you, I validate 100%. It is your life. And whatever is happening in somebody else's life does not in any way mean that what's happening to you that is you're struggling with is not important. It is important because it's your life, individual.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heather. Our last question comes from Amy, and it's a bit of a softer question to take us out. And I think any writers who are with us tonight will be interested in this one. She's wondering how you transitioned into becoming a successful writer, and have you written very much before you wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz?
Not a damn thing, Amy. I wrote my first 65. I should be going into retirement. Instead, I wrote a book. But I had Bloody Story for many years, and I'd written it as a screenplay. I don't know what I thought I was doing writing a screenplay, but I loved his story. I got to meet him. I needed to write it somehow. But yeah, writing a book is something I never ever contemplated doing. But it was only when none of those buggers in Hollywood would look at my script and see what a great story I had, that my sister-in-law in San Diego, who I was visiting, just said, oh, for goodness sake, just write the bloody thing as a book and get on with it. So no experience whatsoever in writing a book, either fiction or non-fiction, until The Tattooist of Auschwitz. And that's why it's a simple book. I use simple language because I am no literary giant, please. It's quite the opposite. And I don't want to be. I'm quite happy telling stories very simply. They make them relatable.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And we know that these are books that have touched so many people. We, one of the great joys of working somewhere like a library is that we get to people about what they've been reading, and we hear time and time again how moved and touched people are by your books. And you, here for me at Hornsby, are one of the authors that I'm constantly asked by my community when you're going to come back to visit. So as you say, I'm sorry that it's not in person, but I'm still so pleased that you can be here with us in this format this evening. So I guess it really is time to let Heather go and get on with her very, very full and busy life. Thank you all to everybody in the audience for spending your time with us this evening. I want to remind you all that, of course, you can buy copies of this book and of any of Heather's books from your local bookseller. And we always encourage you to support your local independent bookshop, because where would we be without them? But of course, you can borrow them all from your local library as well. I'd like you all to join me in thanking Heather so much for a wonderful evening. And I want to finish with a quote from Stories of Hope, which is that stories are what connect us and remind us that hope is always possible. There's never been a truer word spoken, Heather. Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Yasmin, who's in the background there. And
thank you. Thank you, Heather. I hope we get to see you in person sometime very soon. And I hope that at the very least you get to leave the house for a cup of coffee.
Oh, can't wait.
Good night, Heather, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.